Mr. Trump, explain why America First requires eliminating the U.S. Department of Education, by Michael Scheuer, published May 18, 2016, on nonintervention.com. One of the most daunting problems Trump would face in implementing a comprehensive America First orientation in the national government is the Department of Education. Under both Democratic and Republican presidents, the leaders and personnel of that department have for more than 30 years developed and provided anti-American curricula to the nation's schools and have used the control of an enormous budget to force their acceptance and implementation. In particular, their target has been the alienation of young Americans from their own republic's history, which, with a common language, a common faith, and allegiance to the rule of equality before the law, are all Americans have ever had to hold themselves and their union together. The Democrats and the media already have destroyed the first three unifying commonalities, and so the Republic's history is the final target in their quest to divide and conquer America's diverse regions and populations, and then establish one party, authoritarian rule in the United States. In this task, the Department of Education has the leading role. The product being delivered by the Department of Education is just what the authoritarians want, but it cannot for a moment be deemed a truthful, fair-minded education in America's history. The department's product is more accurately termed the deliberate distorting of U.S. history, which is applied in an indoctrination of America's students that leaves them all but ignorant of U.S. history. It also leaves them deeply infused with a near fanatic belief that the United States engages in evil whenever it puts America's first interests first and manifests a durable preference for the Republic's survival over extravagant and always wasted and war-causing funding for the welfare, westernizing and democratizing of poor, suffering, oppressed, diseased, or otherwise unfortunate foreigners, especially, as the saying goes, those of color, which has come to mean anyone who is not English speaking and white. At home it means legal, financial, political, and media preference for any group, no matter how reprehensible, felonious, slothful, or deviant, that reliably votes for the Democrats. In addition, the department's prescribed indoctrination demands the mandatory warding of empathy, sympathy, and limited liability to foreign nations, organizations, and individuals that deliberately attack America, as in U.S. soldiers and Marines not being allowed to fire on the enemy before being fired on. The lack of retribution for Saudi Arabia's ongoing responsibility for generating the Islamists' war against the United States. Official U.S. silence over Israel's international aerial attack that wrecked the U.S. Navy's ship Liberty and killed or wounded many of its crew, and bipartisan acquiescence in the undeclared but vicious war the Mexican government is waging against the U.S. economy and America's sovereignty, independence, language, and social cohesion. For generations of American students, from which have come most teachers at all levels of U.S. education, the idea of America First has been directly and intentionally defined by the Department of Education as American selfishness, racism, isolationism, and anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and a mean-spirited lack of sensitivity to always worthy foreigners. While examples of this Department of Education inculcated anti-America mindset are legion, several recent ones are worth noting. Obama to Hiroshima. Barack Obama is a shining example of the kind of anti-American thinking that results from the Department of Education curricula and the indoctrinated student's application thereof in his professional life. Obama will go to Hiroshima and implicitly apologize for the United States having dropped an atomic bomb on the city in 1945. Now, a basic and truthful education would have informed Obama that Hiroshima suffered a relatively small number of people killed, about 150,000 compared to the 6 to 10 million Asian civilians killed by the Imperial Japanese Army in China, the Philippines, Indochina, and all the other places that Army invaded and occupied. 1. All of the U.S. British, Indian, Filipino, Australian, New Zealand, and Dutch POWs who were murdered, tortured, starved, or otherwise afforded inhuman treatment in prisoner of war camps on the Bataan Death March, or when forced into slave labor. And all of the men from the militaries of America and its allies who were murdered, wounded, or maimed when captured in battles fought to win the war Japan started. Given this accurate context, the only thing any U.S. president should say if he visits Hiroshima is, I come here today to speak in tribute to the men and women who died at the dastardly hands of Japan at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines in December 1941. And I can add that the only regret I have is that the United States did not have a 15 or 20 atomic bombs in 1942, so the U.S. Army Air Force could have lit up all the major cities in Japan's home islands and thereby ended the inhuman and merciless war Japan's emperor, generals, and admirals eagerly imposed on the United States and the world. As for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I can only say, Japan had it coming. Harriet Tubman displaces Old Hickory. This is another piece of rank idiocy derived from the kind of U.S. history being taught at the direction of the Department of Education. Now, there is no doubt that Harriet Tubman was a courageous woman, one who risked her own life to assist blacks trying to escape from slavery. All thanks and praise to her for that bravery. But her actions do not elevate her above the reality that she was at best a bit player in the rancorous and finally violent events that played out in the United States between 1845 and 1865. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, dominated his era as a recklessly brave, fierce, and often wounded American soldier. He fought in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, defeated the Creek Indians, Britain's ally, in 1814, routed a British army at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, erased the U.S. national debt during his presidency, and crushed the proponents of nullification who sought to break the Union in the early 1830s. Even though Jackson owned slaves and forced Indian tribes to move westward, he remains in this case a giant who towers over a brave, decent, but marginally important woman in the terms of historical importance and worth to America. On this issue, a decent and truthful education would have allowed any student to see that Old Hickory, not Miss Tubman, merits the place of prominence on the $20 bill, and b. that the popular acceptance of Obama's vote-buying and pandering to blacks and women decision to place Mrs. Tubman on the bill can only be explained by the success of the Department of Education's ongoing campaign to teach U.S. history in a manner meant to make ahistorical morons of students who will become voters. Such an education denies the students both the ability to assess America's worth as well as its faults, and an understanding of each citizen's responsibility to defend Republican government against its domestic foes. By manufacturing this kind of citizen automaton, the Department of Education reduces the chance of the citizenry exercising its obligatory duty of popular and, if necessary, armed resistance to the tyranny that the department and its masters in the Democratic Party and media are working to install in place of the Republic. There is only one Holocaust that matters. In the United States, the Israel First faction is led by disloyal Jewish American citizens who have bribed, intimidated, and lied the United States into a so far endless war with Islam. One aspect of their ability to do this comes from the lock they have on the term Holocaust, which in their usage refers only to Nazi Germany's murder of 6 million European Jews. Let me say that no one in his right mind would judge this historical fact as anything but an abomination. But because Israel Firsters use their Holocaust and their Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. to endlessly fuel feelings of guilt among contemporary Americans, even though it was the U.S., Britain, and its dominions and the Red Army that utterly destroyed Hitler's regime and ended the Holocaust, and to then exploit that sense of guilt to pry ever-increasing amounts of used taxpayer-funded economic and military aid for Israel, and worse, to keep the United States locked in a largely unnecessary and clearly losing struggle with the Islamists. Now, a decent and truthful education would inform students about holocausts or genocides and provide them with the context with which to understand that while Germany's attempt to annihilate European Jewry was murderous and monstrous, the Führer was a piker in the overall story of the 20th and 21st century holocausts. The military forces of Imperial Japan, as noted above, may have killed as many as 10 million Asian civilians. Lenin, Stalin, and their Soviet successors killed up to 60 million people. Mao and his successors killed at least 65 million people, and as they are still in power, that number is growing. And since 1973, the American Medical Association and American women have murdered nearly 59 million unborn Americans, and may yet skip past Uncle Joe and even Chairman Mao as the leading Holocaust genocide producer of all time. Even Israel is in the big-time mass murder game, with media reporting that between 1.5 and 2 million unborn Israelis, a total reminiscent of Pol Pot or Rwanda's machete wielders, have been murdered by Israeli doctors and Israeli women since the nation's founding. And this in a country that appears doomed in terms of demography. And B, ironically, both Americans and Israelis followed the savvy Hitlerian model of passing laws and gaining judicial decisions that define as non-human entities that irrefutably are human beings. One doubts the Department of Education either issues curricula to teach American students about the wide variety of Holocaust genocides that have occurred and how common they have become, or gives them a scorecard listing how many human beings each of these depravities murdered. And B, the bipartisan U.S. governing class, after all, runs the Department of Education and profits politically and financially from maintaining the idea that there has been only one real Holocaust. It will brook no change that introduces the truth. Have you ever, for example, heard any U.S. politician or European or Israeli politician, for that matter, call for Nuremberg-like trials for the legatees of Stalin and Mao? Such an accurate and truthful course of instruction would not be delivered to help students determine which atrocity was bad, less bad, small but bad, not so bad, or big and bad. The purveyors of all merit prolonged and harrowingly painful attention from a hard-eyed, everlastingly vengeful God. Rather, it would be meant to allow them, as voting adults, to ignore Israel First's guilt-inducing machinations and feel zero guilt about putting America first, by reliably refusing to elect bribe-taking U.S. politicians who are eager to spend their taxes and soldier children's lives uselessly in fighting Israel's or any other nation's endless, bloody, bankrupting, and irrelevant to America wars. All of America's founders, from the most known to the least, believed that the republic they created could survive only if its population was well educated, especially in history, consistently attentive to politics and the media so as to see the approach of tyranny early on, and therefore equipped to identify tyranny if they saw it nearing, and to use their right to destroy any U.S. government that became oppressive, arbitrary, lawless, and or conspired against America with her enemies. Today, the Department of Education stands as the national government's main engine for deliberately miseducating, deceiving, and confusing American students, thereby helping to create an electorate that cannot recognize, resent, and then destroy the tyranny that is steadily taking hold in their republic, especially under Obama, his party, and the media. The ability to make America first the core of an administration's operations, therefore, depends in part on the quick and complete dismantling of the Department of Education, followed by the steady return of responsibility for educating America's students in the Republic's history and all other subjects, including their duty to defend the Republic against internal as well as external enemies, to the lowest possible level of local government and the wishes of their parents.